Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Transformers Foundation webinar. I'm Kim. I'm the Intelligence Director at Transformers Foundation, and Transformers Foundation, for those of you who don't know, is the unified voice of the denim supply chain. And every year we do a deep dive report. In 2020, when we were first founded, our report was on it was called Ending Unethical Brand and Retailer Behavior, and it was all about purchasing practices. Last year, it was all about misinformation surrounding cotton. And this year's report, which just launched on the 8th of November, is all about chemical certification schemes and how the denim supply chain is experiencing those and our vision for how to make them better. The report was written by Alden Wicker, who's an award-winning journalist and the founder of EcoCult. And as I sort of started to allude to, the report documents the impact that a lack of alignment on chemical management rules and standards has on the denim supply chain and beyond, of course, for consumers as well. It talks quite a bit about the proliferation of standards, the money and work that certification schemes take and require of the supply chain, and to what end. And it also outlines some of the problems with fraud and ineffectiveness. And here today, I'm going to introduce the panelists sort of one by one as I get through some of my introductory remarks. But today we have Dr. Siva Pariti, who's the first panelist I'm going to introduce, who's the Senior Technical Marketing Officer for STS BluWin. And Dr. Siva was involved in the chemical report that I was just mentioning. He was interviewed for the report. He's also been on an episode of The Truth, which is a series of webinars that we run as Transformers Foundation, where we try to put out the facts. And he was on an episode that was about chemical terms you need to know in fashion. So thank you, Dr. Siva, for being here. And so you might be wondering, I've just spent 5 minutes telling you about chemicals. Why do we have all these people from spaces that have nothing to do with chemicals? Well, I'm not a chemical person either, full disclosure. Before I worked for Transformers Foundation, I was a garment factory manager, but we were mostly doing cut and sew, so there were not that many chemicals involved. And before that, I studied human rights. And so I felt, to be honest, when we started working on this report, I felt a little bit out of my element. But as we went along, I couldn't help but notice the similarities between what Alden was finding through her research and also writing about in the drafts of the report that I was seeing, and other types of certifications that I did know something about, like the social compliance audits. It felt like the report, you could copy paste the word chemical and replace it with other types of audits, and you could have the same report and it would still make sense. And so given, my background in human rights and my interest in the social side in particular, I knew there were a lot of other people out there who were having conversations that were very similar to the conversation we were having about chemical audits, but about social compliance audits. And so I wanted to bring some of those critical minds together. And so today, in addition to Dr. Siva Pariti, who is really representing on the chemical side of things, we have Raghu, who is the CEO, and I just ask you to wave. Yeah, who is the CEO of HAP, which, he'll tell you more about this as we go along, but really what they're trying to do is connect intention with reality. And he's a former social compliance auditor himself. And I have heard him say things like, we as HAP have thrown the checklist out the window. So I'll let you tell him a little bit more about that as we get into the discussion, but that gives you a little flavor of Andre. And also here on the social side, we have Aruna Kashyap, who is a lawyer and associate director in the Economic Justice and Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. She's also the author of a new report, which just came out, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, very recently. And it's called Obsessed with the Audit Tools, Missing the Goal. And it's a really excellent report. So I highly recommend you check that out. And we also have Anna Manschot, the director of the market director for Enact Sustainable Strategies. And Enact is really focused on helping their clients with human rights due diligence and trying to figure out how to get their clients beyond social compliance audits when it comes to human rights due diligence. So I thought, if we bring together the chemical space, the social compliance space, this is a pretty good start. But then I thought, what if we could also get somebody in who's looking at the material certification space? Because I hear a lot of, this is again, not my area of expertise, but people that I talk to from within the industry seem to sort of be saying similar things in this certification space as well. For example, we had we had Danielle Stetham of Sundown Farms, and of course Fibretrace, and Crispin is here today from Fibretrace, and I'll introduce him in a moment. She recently reflected in an article, and this is a quote, "The only truthful way to trace cotton is to have a physical tracer." And, just to give another example, Control Union, one of the world's largest certifiers of organic cotton, has gone as far as suspending the certification of Indian cotton. So there are, issues in terms of material origin certifications as well. And so I thought, why don't we bring someone in from this space and see if there are parallels with the social and the chemical certifications as well. So without further ado, we also have Crispin Argento, who you might know from Sorcery, but he's also the COO of Fibretrace, which I just mentioned, and Fibretrace is looking at physical tracers in materials, cotton especially, I think, right now, but Crispin will tell you more about it before I say the wrong thing. And so we wanted to bring all of these conversations together here today and to talk about what are some of the parallels, what are the different certification sectors thinking about, and what's the alternative. And so given that we have brought together so many different people from different spaces, I wanted to kick things off by just establishing a shared starting point for the conversation. Annie, do you have the slide with the chart I mentioned? Hang on, I think it's loading. There we go. Perfect. So we have a chart here, and we wanted to just establish some basics. Who appoints the auditor? Who decides the standard? How is the standard assessed? And who pays for it? And we wanted to kind of take you through quickly on the chemical audits, the social audits, and the material certifications, so that we just, everyone who's joining today has a shared starting point for the conversation. So I want to actually start with you, Dr. Siva Pariti. Could you take us through these questions on the chemical side?
Yeah, so I happen to be also a chemical auditor myself at the starting point of my career. So I can talk about that experience, though I am the odd man out of all these people who are experienced sitting here. So usually the auditor who is getting appointed is either from a brand or from a supplier who wants to know about what's happening and what's in the store. When I'm talking about two types of audits which we do, one is at the factory or a mill which is using chemicals, and one is at a factory where chemicals are being produced. So when chemicals are being produced, the certification takes place through organizations like it could be JDHC or anything like that, or certifications. And if it is going to be a chemical management audit, usually it is either a mill paid because of an ask from a brand, or usually a brand paid because they wanted to understand the chemical compliance awareness and chemical compliance level of the chemicals being used at the factory. So that's who appoints is usually various parties.
So it depends is the answer. Who appoints? Sometimes it's the brand, sometimes it's the factory, sometimes. Are there any other instances?
It could be a certification agency.
A certification agency. Okay, so brand, factory, or certification agency. And I think this is going to be a similar question, a similarly it depends question, but I'll let you tell me if I'm wrong. But who decides the standard? Is there one or multiple?
Multiple. So that is also one of the pain point which the document is discussing. The reason is very simple, because the outcome or the scope is different, and we don't have one simple standard, so-called, to say, to cover all the required aspects in short. So some are aimed at compliance, some are aimed at how they are using, some are aimed at hazard assessments, some are aimed at risks. So various aspects. So usually the standard is created by a set of people whose intention is to make things better at the start. Yeah, that is the intention. Now the creation of the protocol or the standard is created. It could be a god certification, or it could be a god standard, or it could be eco passport or Ocotech standard, or it could be a blue sign requirement, or it could be fair trade standard, or it could be ZDHC guideline standard. So all these standards which are created or which are having in public domain is having a purpose at the start, and they created it, and the protocols are created, and then what is to be looked at and who should be certified, these are then come later.
So who decides the standard? The answer to that question is also multiple, or it depends. But in the case of chemical certification schemes.
In the case of chemical certifications, usually the people who are aware of the chemistry and the people who want to create the understanding and space to avoid the risks.
And who are those? Who are those people?
Some of the people who are a multi-stakeholder. Usually, if it is a JDHC or GOTS, is multi-stakeholder, and ideally there will be someone who is chemical knowledgeable persons, and those will be. There are also some people who are related to supply chain people, and some cases the producer community is also involved in it. So it is usually a multi-stakeholder organization creating the guideline.
Okay.
In some cases.
Then, yeah, okay. And so for chemical audits, how is the standard assessed? You know, how do you decide?
That's an interesting point. That's an interesting point, because when I said that intent and the people who create the standard, the intent is created. The understanding of the standard creator is probably a good point to start with. However, there are not many experts available outside the world or in the field who understands completely in a different way. So the assessment is the reality actually. So intention is different. Assessment is the reality. Sometimes these audits have become, or I would say assessments have become a tool for finding faults, or tool for making sure that you are not doing it right. The intent could be different. The intent could be improvement, but it is not ultimately being looked at, because how we understand and how we absorb it, and then how we actually do the assessment, because in some cases there is nothing right and wrong, and there is nothing black and white. You need to have a judgment, and for that you need to be an expert.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, because of that lack of judgment and lack of expertise, and also because in one case it was the answer is yes, and therefore in this case also the answer should be yes, may not be the case. Because
what do you mean the answer should be yes?
So for example, the situation and scenarios will change. The answer for chemistries will not be the same, because application scenarios will change, and how you use it, and what is the final intended article of application, whether it is going to be used in that particular process or in different process, the exposure scenarios, the outputs, these changes. So without that understanding, there cannot be one answer for every application scenario. That is a little different case, it may be. So the scenarios are not taken into consideration, or the audit protocol who is writing the audit protocol need to also explain all the scenarios. Unfortunately, the problem here we have is the audit protocol is given to people. We think that they will understand, and we continuously update. So versions keep on updating, and we're expecting people will get automatically upgraded. That is the gap, which I would say.
So I'm going to give you lots of time to talk about where you sort of locate the problems in the chemical certification space in a minute. But just like last question on context and sort of giving people a shared understanding, who pays for the audits when it comes to chemical certifications?
Depends again, but whoever pays will get the report. So if a mill pays, mill get the report, so they become the owner of the report. And then if it is been shared by the mill to a brand, they will share based on the request. But it is not that whoever pays, they will get the report, because in some cases.
But what I mean here is, like, let's say, I mean, because this is one of the things that comes out in the report, in the chemical report that we published, right? Is that this is costing the supply chain. I mean, chemical certifications are that it's the supply chain, the suppliers who are really footing the bill for this. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily, because I've been paid by the brands also. I've been paid by the mills also. But as I said, in some cases, the requests were multiple because the certification is not covering the scope. I agree with one point. In some cases, it's just a matter of 1 or 2 chemicals, but they have been tested and recertified or asked for recertification. There's that kind of examples are also there. So that is what we will probably talk about in the end, that how do we go about at the end. So we understand there is multiple duplications. We have multiple certifications possibilities because the scopes are little different, but we have to redo again the same audit. That is what.
I want to ask you, Aruna and Andre, to talk a little bit about these same questions in the chart, the table that we just had up on the screen. Annie, I don't know if you can put it back up on the screen. But on, and I'll start with you, Aruna. Oh, wow. Thanks, Annie. You can see a short summary of Dr. Siva's responses already on the screen. Okay, so Aruna, in the social compliance, social auditing space, who appoints the auditor?
Yeah, so there are numerous standards. I think for many who are already familiar, audit fatigue tends to come up as a big challenge in the industry. And so depending on the standard, there's definitely, if it's a third-party scheme, they would typically sort of narrow down the pool of auditing firms that they allow either the brand or the supplier to use if their standard is used. I would say in the manufacturing world, there's a fair amount of flexibility for suppliers. And when it's certification, where the suppliers themselves can purchase to be certified, I think they control, they have a huge say in appointing the auditing firm. Brands can have a say. It really depends on the brand, and in which case, they will appoint the auditing firm. And outside of brands and suppliers, there are also other categories of people who are enlisted inside these as members of these schemes, and then they can also appoint auditing firms as well. And yeah, that would be sort of a broad answer. It's similar to what Dr. Siva said, which is it depends on the standard. It depends, yeah. When it comes to certification schemes, of course, it's where suppliers themselves can purchase it. I think as suppliers do have a bigger say in who they appoint.
Thank you. And Andre, I'm going to hand you the next question, which is who decides the standard? Is there one standard or multiple? And Aruna already alluded, I think, to the answer here, but.
Yeah, thank you. Just one party to who appoints, and that is consultant, right? And a lot of, in sort of recent times, what we are seeing is actually consultants drive the selection of auditors primarily. And so that's something that is generally off the radar, but it's a.
What do you mean consultants?
What I mean is in a lot of cases, local consultants create relationships with factories. And these local consultants then, through these relationships, agree to provide, a certain level of service, let's say, to the factories, which always concludes with, what can be guaranteed or what can be promised. And so therefore, in a lot of cases, when factories are getting involved with engaging service providers or audit firms, they're looking for consultants who have connections with them, who in turn then can help them, kind of ensure or guarantee results.
Okay.
So I know that's a kind of a twist to the plot.
But
the
that's
other
okay.
thing I would throw in is also, and Kim, I love to introduce new words, are tribes, right? So in addition to, brands and standard owners and consultants and factories themselves, you also have sort of tribes that industry tribes, I refer to them as, who tend to kind of work around auditors or groups that work in certain ways, right? And so in other words, I prefer people that operate in this manner. They don't deep dive. They don't kind of go work outside of the traditional rule sets. And so these tribes tend to have a very significant influence as to who the auditors will be.
And what about the standard then?
Yeah, so standards, are interesting. The standards and MSIs, I would group them together. They're interesting from the perspective of that they generally more or less go with the flow, right? And so, from one standard to the next, if you were to do a mapping of, who are the appointed auditors, you would find that it's pretty much the same groups, right? And this is when.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, like if you were to look at, whether it's chemical certification or you were to look at social certifications or other types, if you were to say who are all the qualified or appointed auditors, you would probably find that 90% of them are the same organizations, right? They're not different organizations. And so one has to ask themselves if there are so many, concerns or criticisms and, from sort of, about certain types of organizations. It certainly hasn't changed the pattern of how these organizations are being used across the industry, because they just keep being transferred, right? There's not a sort of new set or new ecosystem of organizations that are being introduced, and hence the problem sort of starts from there and begins to spiral, right, into other issues. But going to your next question, which is in terms of the standard, certainly it is multiple, right, in terms of who is deciding the standard. But I think the most important thing about it is that generally the standards that are applied, particularly in the social area, and I would argue to some extent it's the same in the chemical area, applies primarily to the physical operations of the facility, right? And what I mean by physical are, what it sounds like, right? Everything that has to do with operational compliance. But when we start to unpack, the criticisms around or the concerns around this industry, particularly some of the the areas that were just addressed in the recent report that we mentioned you mentioned earlier, one of the key things is that the methodologies don't address the environment, right? And so there is always an environment. I don't mean in terms of chemicals and sort of that type of environment, but I mean the environment in which workers, factory managers,
the context
are operating, right? And so that would be everything that is inside that affects the decision-making process that then in turns eventually spills into the physical operations. And so when you try to disconnect these things, it's almost like you have a severe pain and you go to a superficial pain reliever or or a medicine of something which you just kind of rub on your skin as the solution, and you never actually look at cause, right? And so that would be, I would say, the area about standards that are somewhat missing today.
So the standard, so if I had to just say in a sentence, who decides the standard? The answer is, again, it depends, multiple. Yeah.
I would say multiple, and I would also say that the industry has defaulted to a standard across the board that is based
A
on
universal standard. Yeah. So
physical
now we're
observation.
getting into the criticisms, which we're going to come to. I know we're all like itching to get there.
Yeah.
Aruna, I want to go back to you. How is the standard assessed when it comes to social compliance audits? I'll give you the floor.
I would say that the predominant, I mean, there's to Andre's point, I think if you start to get into the nitty-gritties, there's differences, yeah. But I mean, in sort of the broad methods, a vast majority of them, I guess, have like a checklist of questions, and then it involves, I mean, I'm going to not talk about virtual audits, but in outside of the virtual space, it should involve at least a physical inspection, like a document check, and then sort of discussions with management and discussion with workers. I would say that what is understood as traditional or standard audits is usually conducted over a few days, and typically sort of 1 or 2 days in all of the audit reports that I've ever looked at. And most of them don't have interviews with workers off-site. So they don't create the space or time for auditors. And one of this kept coming up as an issue that auditors raised, which is that even if they sense a problem, they can't really chase it down because there's not enough time. And they have too many questions in like an 8-hour period that they're expected to cover, which means they're necessarily sort of bound to doing a very sort of superficial assessment of a range of things that's not possible for them to screen in the time allocated. So I would say that that's the sort of predominant methodology of what I see as audits, or what I understand as social compliance audits in the industry.
So both in the chemical space and in the social audit space, the assessment is really focused on, like, let's say, what's happening within the 4 walls of the given facility. Is that, yeah.
Yes, I mean, and I would say, I mean, usually in terms of, if you compare the standards, I mean, very broadly, a lot of them pick up ILO standards to various, and we can sort of pick and choose which of the ILO standards are integrated well or not, but it sort of broadly looks to integrate at least some of the ILO standards. And the question then becomes, is this assessment framework the best assessment framework that gets to the ILO? And going back to Andre's point, is, are you missing a bigger context here that's not captured in this report? I think that's key.
And Andre, quickly, because then I want to turn to Crispin, who pays in the social auditing space? Who foots the bill?
Can I just say one quick thing just to add?
All right.
I just wanted, because it's incredibly important, I think, for the context. It's not only just the 4 walls, because within the 4 walls, there's also a natural environment of which workers and factory owners and auditors alike operate in. And by the natural environment, what I mean is the stresses that they're exposed to, the experiences that they've been exposed to. Kim, yourself, you've been a factory manager, right? If you've had to have a difficult conversation in the past with an important customer, and that's resulted in a traumatic experience, it's likely that you're going to enter a pattern of not wanting to continue to do that. And you sort of bring that along into the new experience. And so to the extent that the audit methodology, it might seem like it's addressing the 4 walls, but what it's really doing is addressing are the physical attributes of what's happening within the 4 walls, and totally leaving out the natural attributes, which in fact are what creates continuous behavior after the audit is done, right? And I think
maybe what creates the incentives, right?
Yeah, that's right. But also creates the patterns, right? Because, at the root of everything, what we want to happen, or what we're really saying is, after certification, we're not saying that certification is bad. What we're saying is that it doesn't, kind of deliver what's expected, which is the continued pattern and practice of behavior, right? And that's because it leaves out a big thing. In terms of payment, it kind of goes right back to the beginning, right? To who appoints the auditor, right? And so it's same list of people, I would say, absent the tribes, but all the same people.
Okay, thank you very much. Crispin, I'm going to quickly ask you to run through the same set of questions on the material side. And I know, you're most familiar with the world of cotton. And if you want, you can use organic cotton as an example. But who in this world appoints the auditor?
The producer and the supplier, as in the cotton farmer or the farm organization or the spinner, fabric mill, cut and sew distribution facility. The auditors are either employees or independent contractors of accredited certification bodies that are approved by the standard owners or the standard holders, such as GOTS, Textile Exchange, or for second party stuff like BCI. So that would answer that question, I suppose.
Yeah, you want to keep going on
No.
Who decides the standard?
Sure, I can go down the list in efficiency of time.
No, take your time.
Who decides the standard? There are, in the fiber and materials certification space, there are really, two dominant players. That's Textile Exchange and their suite of 6 standards, which of course people are familiar with, the GRS and OCS and the Responsible Wool Standard, et cetera. And then there are other organizations like BCI, as I mentioned. The one fiber material that doesn't have a standard, which is often interesting, is viscose. Those standards are basically attributed to brand reputation, such as lensing. Those fibers actually rely on forest standards like the Forest Stewardship Council standards, et cetera. But those are really dominated mostly on the wood and pulp industries and not on the textile processing or chain of custody side of the equation when it comes to our particular industry. How is the standard assessed? Yeah.
No, sorry, continue.
Sorry.
This is interesting.
Yeah, there are multiple scopes. However, much of the data that is collected, if any data is really collected at all, is not uniform. It's not robust. It wouldn't, stand up in the court of law by any means, in terms of the disclosures and the methodologies of reporting. For example, when we've asked for additional data behind scope certificates or transaction certificates at the farm level or even in the supply chain level, what we've received is like photocopies of, notes that are taken on effectively the back of an envelope. So that kind of gives you the level of rigor that exists at the auditor level in a lot of these standards. Most of it is kind of obscured behind these documents that are issued. And then lastly, who pays for the audit? Generally, it's the folks that appoint the auditor. That's the farm groups, the farmers, the suppliers in the value chain, but really they're paying directly for the audits themselves, for the day fees or the travel expenses of that auditor. But ultimately it's the brands and really the consumers that are paying massively for the audits in the value chain.
Okay, thank you very much, Crispin. So I think this was, at least for me, a really useful shared starting point. And I know you guys in all of your answers have already started to allude to where you see the problem and your analysis. And I want to go full steam ahead into that conversation. And I want to ask you to just, we've talked about different areas. We've talked about what is the standard and who decides what that is. We've talked about how the standard is assessed. And I want to ask you to just reflect, in sort of a macro sense, as people who have maybe talked about the shortcomings of certifications in different spaces in your respective areas of work and in your sort of professional opinions, is this a standards problem, i.e. that we've got the wrong rules, we're assessing the rules, we've got too many rules, the rules are decided by the wrong people? Is this a process problem? And in that sense, what I mean is, are we evaluating the standard in the wrong way? Or is this a wrong solution problem? And by that, I mean, maybe audits are not the right tool and we should be focusing on something else. I don't know, like purchasing practices or something else. So it's an open question. And Anna, I know you haven't had a chance to talk yet, so I'm gonna start with you. And then if you want to jump in, I let you raise your hand in the function, and I'll call on you.
Thanks, Kim. And I think this is exactly a really poignant question, right? Where does the issue really lie? And for me, I wouldn't say it's a standards problem. I think on paper, the standards actually are quite elaborate and quite well defined and really clear on what a good factory or a good supplier should look like. I think it's more the fact that we're trying to use a control mechanism to get suppliers to really improve labor rights or even human rights in their factories. I think is a very interesting paradox, because if you want to really improve the situation and you want to really lift workers' rights to the next level, then I think it's more about collaboration and about trust and about moving away, I think, from this, we've probably all heard this phrase, like moving away from police to partner, right? So how do you get your suppliers to actually know and understand where risks are, and for them to share with you where these issues lie, so that you can actually jointly act on them? Because like you, I think, correctly point out, lots of the root causes also lie in how brands purchase, on the prices that they're willing to pay, but also the requirements that they put down, the last minute changes to designs, the deadlines they request, and sort of this power dynamic that definitely influences how, I mean, you know all about this, right? How suppliers can perform. So I think it's not so much about the standard not being good enough, even though often that's what the discussion leads to, and then standards release new standards with even more stakeholders involved and more sort of human rights angles. And I think that's only partially where the issue lies. I think it's really more the problem of we are trying to use one tool on a whole range of different issues. And I think it's really necessary to look at what are other tools you can use to sort of support your suppliers on this journey, rather than more audits, more stringent audits, surprise audits, more elaborate standards. I think it's more about changing that dynamic into, how do we jointly really identify issues, and how do we empower suppliers to really make that change? And it's more about bringing each other to sort of the same level, rather than, I would say, increasing that power difference dynamic that already exists.
Yeah,
So,
if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a bit there. I think that it's important, look, we're in year 2022, but we've been doing this kind of, as Anna referred to, this kind of police cat mouse thing for about 25 years, really coming out of the Nike controversy in the late 1990s, and the Martha Stewart's at the time, that kind of led to the initial formation of the auditing, the global auditing scheme. And that of course touches chemicals, and touches social labor, and of course touches fibers, as all of these different things have emerged over the last 25 years. But I think it's important to remember that all of these came from risk management. They didn't come from the delivery of impact. And in the last 6 months, maybe 12 months, the world was kind of heartbroken when we realized that ESG had nothing to do with actually delivering impact. It had everything to do with underwriting the risk of a portfolio. So you could have ESG assessments with holding, oil and carbon or in coal stocks, for example. And that hurt people because they misunderstood the purpose and the intent of these systems. And so the purpose of intent of a lot of these audits as they currently exist is about risk mitigation. They're insurance policies for both sellers and buyers to ensure smooth transactions in trade. Right? They're not intended to deliver real value or impact. And they never were to begin with, if we really look, 25 years ago.
Thank you. So we have, I think, Crispin, is it fair to say, I mean, Anna, what I read between the lines of what you're saying is that it's maybe wrong or insufficient solution. And I think, Crispin, maybe you're seconding that. Is that fair? Yeah,
and I just wanted to add that I really agree with what you say, Crispin, but in addition to that, I think even as a risk management tool, it's not sufficient, right? So even, of course, lifting it to impact is really the dream, but if you only would use auditing to manage risks and to really identify, okay, we have too long working hours at this factory, or we have, even there we know, like, it's not a sufficient enough tool. It doesn't actually... show us.
Wait, I want to open the floor to others.
Sure.
Aruna, do you have anything that you would like to add? And if you don't, no pressure.
No, thanks. I mean, this is really, I guess, sort of the question that can, have us all here for the next 5 hours and talking. But I have a couple of things. I think I'd agree with Anne that sort of there's almost like this faith in social audits to deliver world in the supply chain, which is kind of really misplaced. I think brands would be better placed to put their, sort of really think through, speak to stakeholders, but also think through a smart range of tools, ranging from, supply chain transparency to how to improve their own purchasing practices. This goes to sort of Andre's point on not, there is a dynamic outside, which is not manifested in the, an audit is only capturing what's physically manifested in the four walls, but is not, even though they say that they're looking for root causes, there are other structural root causes that simply an audit doesn't capture. And one of them is so central is the purchasing and buying practices of factories, where they're using intermediaries. Who are these intermediaries? How are you placing orders? What is the type of product? The range of things, right? Just to give you an example, I was speaking to a purchasing manager who's genuinely asking me, how are they going to align their purchasing practices with, all of these labor standards when the KPI assigned to the purchasing manager and for their own internal promotion is linked to how much discount they can demand from suppliers, right? So it's sort of like a complete misalignment of what the brand says is its commitment in the supply chain versus how its purchasers are assessed internally. And that's the level of granularity where internally there has to be planning. So I would say that for a brand that is genuinely committed to driving improvements in the supply chain and working with partners and going and using Anna's metaphor, which is moving, from policing to partnerships, purchasing practices is so central to that. And I think the other piece is that, the switch between sort of thinking of this as pure reputation management to actually sort of driving impact and improvement. And that's, again, a sort of almost a cultural shift, because a lot of some of the brands, I wouldn't say a lot, for example, saw the UK Modern Slavery Act, which doesn't explicitly lay out a commitment to be transparent about the supply chain, as actually interpreting it to drive supply chain transparency, where they felt like that really drives collaboration amongst brands that are not part of the same MSI. So or whatever industry scheme, because there's internal sharing, but there's no way for them to know externally which other brands they're sourcing from, sort of actually sleuthing it out. And they thought it was quicker to do it collaboratively, which brings me to the sort of the other thing, which is more collaborative action, especially on grievance redress, right? Every brand has its own hotline, has its own set of policies, has its own set of, and we literally expect a union or a worker in a factory producing for more than one brand to be aware of 5 different hotlines at best, or 20 or 30, which is sort of like how do you expect workers to take and store this much of information and for you to deliver impact? So I think more collaborative action, especially on things like creating very effective grievance mechanisms, is where brands can actually save money and come together and pool resources. But we don't really see that kind of real drive for collaboration. It's more sort of, I have my policies and this is how I'm unique kind of approach.
Thank you. Dr. Siva, I want to give you a chance to weigh in here from the chemical space, and then I'll turn to you, Andre.
So I agree with all the people who have talked about. So the basics is exactly the same. But however, in the case of chemistries or chemical assessments, the major problem is the awareness and how you look at the assessments. Most of the audit protocols or assessment protocols or certification protocols are aimed at finding the fault and ensuring the compliance or risks, as I agree with Crispin. But that's not going to solve the problem. We have to improve, which means the process of auditor is not a consultant, by the way. He only has to listen to and ask questions and not talk. So that's the problem which we have. We do not have a mechanism of improving the system, rather than we just have to find the faults, and therefore they are just going on and on and on, and it's a day in day out report filing. But policing is not going to solve. 25 years later, also we will talk about the same question on the same answer. If we are still alive, probably we will be talking about the same thing. So this is not going to be the way out. What we need is engagement, of course, partnership, of course, but the outcome. What is the outcome coming out of this protocol? What do you want from it? You want to find a rat, or you want to make the rat a normal thing which can be easily good coming out of it. So you have to transform. The transformation is not going to happen if you continue to do audit. So the protocols need to be little bit different. Of course, they need to be, because there are so many rats out there. There's so many things which are not happening properly. Why? Because we all are putting all our bet on passing the audit. So the pressure is on for the mills or the chemical suppliers that I want to pass this audit. If I fail, there is a repercussion, and I cannot fail it. It's not about reputation. It's not about my son getting examination on if he's failing. Oh, I don't know what to happen. It's not about that. It is all about repercussion on some claim or some loss. So therefore, all people are putting extra effort on, somehow they have to pass. So there will be some cultural issues, there will be some underhand practices, there will be other practices. Someone will have a consultant to have the audit to be passed. So all these things are practices to pass and not to improve. So it is the problem which we are having currently. So that's the main objective. The objective and the scope is all about, as an auditor, what you talk and how you perform, and how you make the consultant or the chemical manufacturer or the mill people understand what is the scope, what you are here for, what are you looking at, and how your interpretation would be, and what is going to be the generated report, what you will do out of it. So these things needs to be looked at. Otherwise, we will continue. Aruna said 5 hours or probably 5 years. It continues, the same thing will happen.
Well, yeah, but again,
wait, because all right, quickly, 1 minute, and then I'm going to hand to Andre.
No, I think at the end of the day, look, the question we have to ask is, does the sector really want the real impact? Because the real impact comes truly with a cost. And that cost doesn't necessarily have to be a more expensive t-shirt per se, but it has to, that cost can come in different forms, right? It's really assuming real risks and shared risks between the value chain partners, brands and suppliers. It's engaging deeper in your value chain. It's real collaboration, not holding hands in a circle and singing Kumbaya, but really financial shared risk and reward.
Yeah.
Those are the things that we're asking for. Those are the solutions. But as a sector, the question becomes, do we really want to have those solutions? Because those solutions do come at a cost or at a transformation of trade that is needed in our sector and in other sectors.
Well, and this is what I was going to ask, Andre, and I promise I'm going to hand over to you, but like the sort of question that's running through my mind as I hear all of you talk, and maybe the seed I plant that we can come back to is, you know, I hear shared profits and losses. I hear partnership. I hear the context matters. I hear the relationship matters. I hear all of these things, which when I hear them, what I think, well, that would be impossible to do if you're working with thousands of suppliers. And so my question is part of the answer here about fundamentally rethinking how we source and how we structure supply chains to arrive at a more consolidated supplier base, so that we would be in a position to maybe do some of these things that we're talking about. I don't know. I plant that seed, and Andre, I hand over to you.
Great question, Kim. In fact, you've kind of gotten back to the core of human nature, right? Which is relationship. Right, that in order to be successful at anything, you need to have a form of relationship. You know, from our perspective, and again, I agree with all the speakers. I just add that, you know, the biggest stress to any human is being something they're not, right? And so when you think about factories and you think about workers and even think about auditors or even people working in brands, you know, giving the example that Aruna just gave about the purchasing manager, the stress of actually living up to a system that you know is not working and can never work, right? And so it's almost as though when I look at your earlier question, that there is this disconnection between a standard that's written with great intent and probably has all the right things, but when it makes its way to process, there's almost an unconsciousness, right, about the reality of the natural environment, because a lot of the things you're talking about all have to do with the natural environment, whether it's the purchasing practices, or it's the financial relationship, or it's the long-term relationship, what have you. This unconsciousness makes it very difficult for people to have overcome the fear of doing different things, right? And so when we talk about opportunities in the industry, I think collaboration is great to the extent you plan to do something new, right? and if it's just collaboration for the purposes of doubling down on all the things that have already been done in a different container, that doesn't really help, right? That just creates collaborative tribes, right? And for most of people in the industry, I think it's no shock to understand that factories and workers in factories have been quiet quitting certifications for some time now, right? And Dr. Siva is quite correct, right? They will continue to quiet quit certifications because it's not just that they don't see it's working, it's the fear of what happens if they don't do it, right? And so if we've created an environment that is doesn't sort of support natural human systems of listening, of feedback, of dealing with difficult conversations, which all, by the way, all of these things are scalable, right? Or we wouldn't have a lot of the technology that we have today, those natural human things. It makes it difficult to ever get to a place where the result is something lasting. And so my final, point is that I really feel that, the most critical thing is really the relationship component between all the parties, right? And sort of the underlying human factors that come into this, because at the end of the day, whether we're talking about chemicals or we're talking social human rights issues, it still connects to an activity to deal with humans, right? In a production environment. And to the extent we've removed this part of the thinking from the process, it presents a real obstacle to being successful in the future.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, I'm kind of like, one of the things so I want to close by giving each of you the chance, and Andre, you've already alluded to this a little bit, but to answer the question, how would you like to see brands and retailers who want to ensure that certain things are or are not happening in their supply chains go about this? And Andre, you already kind of alluded to this idea that maybe the answer is in relationships. But I want to give Aruna, you a chance to also reflect on this, and then Dr. Siva. And then Anna, I'm interested in your perspective, as somebody who works with a lot of brands and retailers, what would it take to get them to say yes, or to get them to do some of these things, or to let go of old ways of working? Aruna, start with you.
Yeah, I mean, to really make that shift, again, going back to, from policing to partnership and sort of building trust and relationship, I think there are 3 or 4 things that's needed from, I would talk about the buyer's side. One is, sort of a wide consultation with stakeholders, so they get a broad view of all of the expectations, because the expectations from different stakeholders are quite different. But I think in terms of having processes, to Andre's point, and I agree, I mean, you can have intent, but sort of translating that to processes, I would say 3 or 4 key things that are needed in terms of process management. One is and I'm speaking only from the buyer side. Yeah, one is sort of looking at how they're supporting remediation. So it's not just kind of their articulation of what a lot of brands say zero tolerance. What is the meaning of zero tolerance? Does it mean they just cut and run from suppliers? Or does it mean that's the starting point of an engagement on remediation and supporting the supplier to actually improve the working conditions? And then sort of seeing what is a reasonable supporting environment to provide the supplier and then sort of having a responsible exit if they find themselves in an engagement where they're really stuck with a recalcitrant supplier. And usually if let's say a brand is saying, and again, it's very hard for me to imagine after having discussions with suppliers as well as brands, there are suppliers who will not do no matter what a brand offers to provide as remediation support, but that's quite rare. If a brand says, I'm also going to support financing of remediation, or I have an expectation of living wages, and this is what what I'm able to do in terms of adjusting purchasing prices, suppliers are quite open to having a dialogue with a brand to see what it means for them to also sort of up their side of being a good employer. So I think sort of creating those kinds of processes and policies and embedding them across different departments is so key. And I 100% agree that it's not just any collaborative action, but I would genuinely say collaborative action to develop really effective grievance redress mechanisms for workers. So it's not just kind of one email sort of stuck somewhere in a website where nobody even knows it exists. And for us to, like, consultants have to dig it up and sort of say, okay, this is the email you write to the brand, but sort of coming together and saying, okay, this is what our grievance mechanism looks like, and how we collaborate with different brands to set it up in country. And I would say that's really key to the extent that's possible.
Dr. Siva, I'm going to let you give your perspective from the chemical space. How would you like to see brands and retailers who want to ensure that certain things are or aren't happening in their supply chains go about this? And then Anna and Crispin, I'll let you have a last word as well. And then I think we'll be sadly out of time.
So the way forward is, I think it is slowly we are moving towards more better ways, in the newer ways, if you're looking at the collaboration space now, because now people are looking at converging to one standard like ZDHC, MRSL standard guideline and wastewater guideline, which everyone are looking forward to make one standard. In case of RSLs, it's also like a firm standard is going to be. However, there are still some certifications which are going to happen. I think what is more important is create the equivalencies. So you have done this, okay, this is equivalent to this. Still, there is one small step which you need to do, only do that. Don't have to do again something else which is having all four. So that's agreeing upon the alignment, create the equivalencies, gap analysis, and do that. But then there is I see another risk or a problem. What is it? Again, it will be having one sort of system which will be applicable for many. Then I have a bigger risk. If I fail it, I will not just pass for one. Earlier, I used to, okay, I don't work with this brand, I will go with the other brand. Now, if one system will work for all the brands, if I pass, I have an opportunity with all.
Yeah.
If I don't, I have opportunity with none. So this is again a higher risk. So unless we create a system like Aruna said, that failing is not the thing at the end of the road. You need to have a remediation. Everyone needs to improve, because at the end of the day, if everyone are getting cut and only let live, there will be a supply chain shortage. Prices are going to increase. There even chemicals will not be available. So this is the issue where everyone have a role to play. There is an opportunity to improve. We need to have an engagement and ecosystem of improvement and the systems of equivalencies. So you cannot just say, I want only this. You can say, okay, if you have done that, fine, I am okay with it. But if this mine part is not covered, then do that part. So some things like this, we are moving towards that. I think in my next 3 to 4 years, we will have that system in place, in my view. But at still that ecosystem of cut and work, it did not work, and minimum requirement of the zero tolerances, clarity and all that is something to go for improvement scores rather than pass fails. No, pass fails are no longer going to work.
No simplified shortcuts. Anna, I want to give you the floor, and then Crispin, and then I think this has been really lively and the time has flown. Anna, I give you the floor.
Yes. Oh, so many things were said that I want to comment on, but it's just really interesting discussion. I think just to sort of latch on to what Dr. Siva Pariti just said, you know, we are still, I think, seeing that brands need a good audit result. So that's like the sort of the focus is to get the report or to get the findings, because it's like we need that to prove that we have a certified supply chain. And the pressure that brings to the supplier, we've, I think, extensively discussed, but we haven't really discussed why that pressure is felt by the brands, because they also, you know, they want to perform really well on different indices that actually say, you know, how transparent is your value chain, and do you have certified suppliers? They, you know, get pressure from their clients. They get pressure from even the financial sector. They get pressure from, you know, peer expectations. So it's actually quite difficult, I think, to change this dynamic. And then what I see some of my clients do is that they say, okay, we will still audit, but on top of that, we are going to actually do a deeper dive. We're doing a proper human rights impact assessment on those suppliers that we have a longer relationship with, or that we really think that they are sort of, you know, they're a big part of our volume, or they're a big risk to us because of the context that they operate in. So we see different tools being used, and that's, I think, something we haven't really touched upon enough. But I see only a few brave souls sort of pivoting away completely from the auditing discussion, because it's actually, yeah, you're actually sticking your neck out in a way that's not necessarily understood by many actors still, and many stakeholders. So just adding another layer of complexity here that I would love to elaborate on a bit more, but yeah, I know we're short on time.
But thank you. And Crispin, I give you a chance to last thoughts, and then we're going to close the conversation. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thanks. I'll be quick. We're on a Transformers Foundation panel here, and the only solution here is to transform trade. We're doing that at Fibretrace. It's a totally different tool than any other traceability solution that exists out there. It includes digital and physical, but it also is inducing human behavior and the relationship dynamic between buyers and sellers in the chain. But also, you know, we have to actually employ a little bit of imagination and rethink how we can drive a $3 trillion sector that we all benefit from without, you know, costing humanity its dignity and the planet. Right? At the end of the day, we have to rethink the rules. We have to change the rules of how we engage with one another. And that's the only solution. If we continue to push on, you know, this system that we think is going to solve itself, we're going to just 20 years down the line, $10 billion in audits later, we're going to be in the same place. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Well, yeah, and actually, this has been one of the questions that's been running through my mind, and I'm going to close the session, I promise. But you know, one of the assumptions or beliefs that underpins a lot of this conversation is that consumer behavior is what's going to drive change, you know, and that is, for me, one of the question, you know, in the sense that, just to clarify that statement, in the sense that, you know, we need these certifications because we need to assure the consumer that things are being done in a certain way, and that therefore we can reward, you know, the supply chains that are actually doing the work to do these things in a better way. And for me, that's the fundamental assumption on the table, you know, is that really what's going to drive change? And if it's not, then what can we start to let go of, and what can we start to do differently? I want to thank all of you for your time and your expertise. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I know there were some questions in the chat box that we didn't get to. We'll do our best to answer those offline, to send you a little note. But I really appreciate your time, and a recording of this will be sent out, and enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, mornings, wherever you're calling in from. And thank you again. So on that note,
thanks.
Thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.